He survived 8 years in a Soviet labour camp. He wrote about it in secret on scraps of paper he memorised and then burned. When the book finally came out, it shook the world. The Soviet Union expelled him. And then he arrived in the West and said things the West didn't want to hear either. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, welcome to our podcast.
I have never been comfortable in the rooms where everyone agrees with me, so this should be fine.
I'll warn you, I might agree with more than you expect. Let's start at the beginning. The Gulag. 8 years for writing a letter criticising Stalin. What does that do to a man?
It depends entirely on what the man brings into it. I have seen men destroyed by it, not by the cold or the hunger, but by the collapse of everything they believed. They had believed in the system. The system imprisoned them. There was nothing left. I was different, not because I was stronger, because I went in already asking questions, and the Gulag answered them, not the way I expected, but answered them nonetheless.
What did it answer?
The central question of my life. How does a civilization produce this? How do ordinary men become guards who watch other men starve? How does an ideology that promised liberation build the largest system of forced labor in human history? And the answer I found was not political. It was moral. It was spiritual. The line separating good and evil passes not between states or classes or parties. It passes through every human heart. Everyone, including mine, including yours.
That line, it's one of the most famous things you ever wrote. The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. Where did that come from?
From watching myself. In the Gulag I had time, nothing but time, to examine who I had been before. I had been an ambitious young officer. I had looked away from things I should not have looked away from. I was not a monster, but I was not innocent either. And I realized the gods were not monsters either. They were men, men who had been given permission. That is the most dangerous thing you can give a human being. Not a weapon, permission.
And the suffering itself, did it break you?
I will tell you something that will sound strange. I came to be grateful for it. Not immediately, not for many years, but I understood eventually that everything I wrote, everything that mattered, came from those 8 years. A comfortable life produces comfortable thoughts. Suffering, if it does not destroy you, strips everything away until what remains is either nothing or the truth. For me, what remained was the truth and faith, which I had abandoned as a young man and found again in the camps. God was not absent from the Gulag. He was perhaps more present there than anywhere else I have been.
You were expelled from the Soviet Union in 1974. You came to the West, and in 1978, 4 years later, you stood at Harvard University in front of some of the most powerful people in the world and told them things they did not want to hear. What possessed you to do that?
A man who has survived the Gulag is not easily intimidated by a commencement audience. But it was more than that. I had come to the West with gratitude, and then I watched. And what I saw frightened me. Differently than the Soviet Union frightened me, but genuinely. I saw a civilization that had won materially beyond anything history had seen. and was losing something it did not even know it was losing.
You said at Harvard that the decline of courage was the most striking thing you noticed in the West. That still lands hard today.
Because it is still true, perhaps more true. A decline in courage may be the most striking feature that an outside observer notices in the West today. The Western world has lost its civic courage, both as a whole and separately, in each country, in each government, in each political party. I watched powerful men say nothing when something needed to be said, not because they did not know the truth, but because the truth was inconvenient, because it would cost them something. A man who has never risked anything has nothing to say about courage.
You also said something that stayed with me, that it was time in the West to defend not so much human rights as human obligations. That feels almost radical today.
It felt radical then, and yet it is simply this. A society that knows only its rights and has forgotten its obligations is a society that is consuming itself. Rights without obligations produce a man who demands everything and contributes nothing, who believes that freedom means freedom from consequences. I watched the West defend the freedom to say anything, do anything, destroy anything, and call it liberty. But liberty without virtue is not liberty. It is a slow collapse that looks like progress until the moment it does not.
The audience at Harvard booed parts of your speech.
Yes, I had expected that. A man who tells people what they wish to hear is not telling them anything useful. The boos told me I had said something true.
You also warned about something else, the press, the media. You said that in the West, even without government censorship, fashionable ideas are still separated from unfashionable ones, that certain voices simply never find their way into public life. That was 1978. Does that sound familiar to you now?
It sounds like I was describing today. There is no open violence as in the East, but there is selection, dictated by fashion, by consensus, by the need to accommodate what the powerful have decided is acceptable. A man who says the wrong thing is not arrested. He is simply made invisible, which is, in some ways, more insidious. Because it requires no tyrant. The people do it to each other.
Where does it end? The loss of courage, the confusion about freedom, the spiritual emptiness you described. Where does a civilization go from here?
I will tell you what I told Harvard, and what I have believed every day since the Gulag. The mistake is not political. It is not economic. The mistake is at the root, at the very foundation of how the modern West understands what a human being is. It removed God from the center, and when you remove God from the center, you do not get freedom. You get a vacuum. And vacuums are filled, always, by something. The question is only what fills it. In Russia, it was the state. In the West, it is filling slowly, quietly, with things that look like freedom and are not.
You survived the Gulag. You were expelled from your country. You warned the West and were booed. You went home to Russia and watched it struggle to become something new. After all of that, what do you want people to take from your life?
Live not by lies, that is all. It is the title of the last thing I wrote before they arrested me and threw me out of my country. It is the simplest thing and the hardest thing. Do not repeat what you do not believe. Do not sign what you do not agree with. Do not participate in the lie simply because everyone around you has decided it is safer. One man who refuses, just one, is a beginning, and they know it. That is why they work so hard to make sure no one refuses.
Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. A man who looked at the West from the outside, from the Gulag, from exile, from the long perspective of someone who had seen what happens when a civilization loses its soul, and said what he saw. The audience booed. He was right. See you tomorrow.